What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of JaAR. JaAR, for those of you that may be new, stands for Joe
and Amy
Review. It's our weekly show where we review the magic stories as they're posted on Wizards' website, and we are knee-deep in the Ravnica Allegiance stories. So this week we have Rage of the Unsung, and as all of these stories have been for quite some time, by Nikki Drayden. Trust me, that is not a complaint by any means. So, quick review at the top. Let's go to our resident Gruul. Amy, what did you think of this week's story?
I actually loved this week's story. Yeah, that's all I'm gonna say, I think, for the quick review.
And we'll get to the full review later. I will say, I also enjoyed this week's story. I will say, if you asked me, I would say I don't think I loved it as much as last week's. But I still very, very much enjoyed it.
See, and I was afraid, as you called me, Resident Gruul, that I would not like this story as much as I liked last week's, and I liked it more.
Okay, so there you go. So you have a little bit of perspective, but realize that we are still both saying that we very much enjoyed it. So if for whatever reason you have not had a chance to go read the story yet, the link in the description will take you to that story so that you can read it for yourself. But yeah, otherwise we are now going to go into our summary. So yes, please feel free to go read that if you want to remain spoiler free. But, you know, spoiler alert. So this week's story, we have our main character, a Viashino, named Arus. We will take a guess. Arrus. Our pronunciation guess is probably as good as yours. Yeah, so we meet Arus, and the story starts with another content warning, and we can talk about that later. But we find out that Dryzek, a giant from the Gruul clan, has escaped from prison or returned from prison. And we find out that Dryzek is, like, Arus loves Dryzek. And we can talk about that later as well. But Dryzek is back. He is a giant. He is now helping the Gruul clan in their war. And Arus describes this war where they are going through and basically destroying any semblance of civilization. Homes, buildings, construction of any kind, they are breaking it down and returning it to nature, seemingly, so that they can kind of expand out and destroy all of the construction that has been put together by the other guilds. There's a little bit of tension because it seems like the Viashino think that Dryzek is going to try to challenge Rurik and Thar. Rurik and Thar, depending on how you want to say it, but it is a two-headed ogre. And it sounds like Dryzek is going to be challenging for the right to lead the clan, which is, like I said, a little bit of tension there. And some of the Viashino aren't sure. It's not really official. We'll find out later. So we then find out that this Viashino, Arus, our main character, is a tattoo artist. And he is super excited that he's going to get to do tattoos on Dryzek. He loves Dryzek. We've talked about this. So he's super happy that he's going to get to tattoo the hero, their hero, Dryzek, who's returned and is destroying. And basically they tattoo the destruction that they have wrought on their skin. And he talks about his expertise with tattooing and the fact that he makes his own ink. He's not really much of a fighter. And in fact, we find out that the Gruul are able to tap into this thing called the Rage. Rage with a capital R. And it's the thing where they all get hyped up and they're screaming and they're breaking things. And Arus, when he has the opportunity to be among Gruul who are raging, he just fakes it. Because we find out that he has never been able to tap into his rage before. And he tattoos Dryzek, and he tattoos his cousin and some of the other Viashino, and later on in the night, because he finds that one of the maca that he got scat from, which is one of the ingredients for his ink, it was not as pure and green as he expected it to be. Instead, it was somewhat brownish green, or greenish brown. And so it turns out because of that, the ink had a bad reaction. And so later on in the night, when they raged or what have you, the tattoos burst into flames and burned whomever he had tattooed.
Caught fire.
Yeah, just randomly. And they burned whomever he had tattooed earlier that night. Because of this, Rurik Thar came over, and Rurik, the Rurik head, he picked him up, and the Rurik head said, your services are no longer required, and he was kicked out of the guild. So I think the first time in these stories that we've seen a main character, for any portion of the story, become guildless.
Yeah.
And he is now wandering around, and he finds an animal that has been eaten, and he finds its bone, and he realizes that the bone, or he eats the animal, I think, for sustenance.
Yeah, because he's able to like trick the other I don't know, whoever's training.
Oh, no. Remember, there were goblins. That was
Goblins.
what it was. There were 2 goblins, and he was able to kind of steal some of the meat and run away.
Yeah.
And in eating the meat off of the bone, he then finds the bone and finds that it's really malleable. And he comes to realize that, he tried to explain away the tattoo thing by saying, the Maka are really sick, and I can't get the proper ingredients from their scat to make my ink. Well, turns out that's a problem all over. And he then comes across the new tattoo artist, Boz. And through talking to Boz, he ends up eventually later on finding out that she is a big-time member of the Gruul clans as well. He is it's seemingly a Gruul fanboy, or at least a soldier fanboy, or a fighter of the clans fanboy, because he knows so much about the Gruul clans and their wars and their heroes and what their heroes have done and have accomplished. And so he's like nerding out a bit and geeking out with her, which I mean, I can respect that a little bit. That, he's like, oh, and you did this fight, and you did this fight, and you did this, and that was incredible. And then your boyfriend, you 2 were together, and she stops him and she goes, do not finish that sentence. And turns out they had some history apparently, and so she didn't want to talk about it. But so we come to find out that she is the new tattoo artist, and he is like really interested in getting her ink because her ink looks really good. It's glowing correctly and nicely, and he wants that because he didn't have that. So he tries to steal it. She catches him stealing it and beats the crap out of him. A lot. And in doing so, he spills the ink on the ground. He's left broken and bloodied, and the ink spilled into the ground, and some vines come up from where the ink had spilled, touch him and heal him in the process, mend his broken bones, etc.
Yeah.
He travels with with Boz, and by with her, I mean he stalks her a bit.
Yeah.
Stalks behind her a bit and follows her and tries to find out where she's going so that he can get some ingredients as well, or maybe steal some ingredients from her to find out how she does what she does. She travels very far away from where the Gruul clans are to get her ingredients, which is probably why she does as well as she does. And she is stealing a Hydra egg, which is another piece of the puzzle, if you will, along with some pine bark. So she teaches him, after they meet up again, she teaches him how to properly gather pine bark, how to properly, God bless you.
Sorry.
How to properly gather scat, and he finds some Hydra eggs as well, or sees that she has found many Hydra eggs in comparison to him, where he was saying that he was struggling to find Hydra eggs, that he was finding like only a couple, or the ones that he found, like the shells weren't hard enough to keep the contents inside, so he wasn't getting as successful with that, and she ends up finding like, I think they said like 50 or 60 eggs inside of a
Nice
hole in the ground. Yeah. So, but it was because she traveled so far. And she ends up running away from the Hydra because she was able to steal an egg from the Hydra, but the Hydra kind of noticed and followed, and so she ran away. He, having been stalking her, runs away, and that's when she sees him. They meet up, they talk. She's still a little upset with him, but they end up bonding over his love of what she has done once he finds out who she is, as well as there's a moment where there are boar coming towards them, and it's a whole herd of boar, if you will, charging. And she said, listen, this is what you do. You don't, he turns to try to run away. She stops him, turns him around, and says, no, you stand your ground, get aggressive, and they should turn away. So, and leave. She shows him the proper stance. The boar eventually do turn away and leave, which is good for him. And he ends up being able to go back to his clan. He's like, I know what's going on here. These animals are dying. the ground, the nutrients coming out of the ground are not properly nourishing these plants. So the animals aren't getting the nutrients that they need because the plants aren't getting the nutrients that they need. Something is going wrong here. And through talking to Boz, he finds out not just something, the Selesnians are doing it.
Yeah.
Because he even mentions that he cares about the shared interest in nature that the Gruul and the Selesnians have, aka their shared color of green.
Right.
But their care and consideration for nature. And yet he finds out that the Selesnians are planting a bunch of saplings and stealing the life force or the energy or the nutrients from the Gruul lands to grow their own plants.
Right.
And furnish their own lands. And he says...
It's not like it's just... And it's not just like they're siphoning some energy because the stuff that's naturally occurring needs more nutrients. No, they're sort of manufacturing this
orchard,
growth.
or I think he even said like man-made garden or whatever. Like
Yeah.
they're really trying to make their own thing here, and
Like he kept referencing the fact that like it's the same 4 trees like over and over and over again. It's like a pattern.
yes,
Because it's just that's it's fake.
yeah,
I mean, they're real trees, but
they're fake planted in those rows
right,
and
but
appropriate.
It's not as if they were just growing there.
Right, they're not natural. They're not naturally occurring. So, so he realizes this, and now kind of comes to the realization that the Gruul clans kind of knew it too. I mean, they did, but they didn't. They knew that there was a problem. They just didn't necessarily know where it was coming from. But his leaders were not, Rurik Thar specifically, I guess in this case, weren't really confronting the problem. And so he returns with Boz with this new information. And he walks up to Rurik Thar and he says, oh, by the way, that is what Dryzek earlier had said to him when realizing that he wasn't really raging. Dryzek says, I'm 830-something years old. I know when someone's faking rage. You are faking it big time. And don't worry, I didn't get my rage until I was 106. and of course, Aris here is like, even Dryzek? Dryzek, this great, amazing person that I love, even he didn't get his rage until he was 106? And Dryzek says, you'll figure out what makes you angry.
Yeah.
What you're gonna get angry about. And so, spoilers, this Selesnian thing, that's what makes him angry. Coming to that realization, and so now he knows that he has that rage, and he can tap into it. So, with it, he goes back to Rurik and Thar. He goes back to them, and he challenges them to a fight for control of the Gruul clan. And Rurik Thar's like, God, because Aris figures I can't get him to listen to me about this stuff when I want him to, but he can't refuse a challenge. That's how the Gruul clans work. He can't refuse a challenge. So Rurik gets up and very easily beats him. But he gets right back up and he says, I challenge you again. Kind of, getting angry, but not quite rage yet. Rurik beats him again. And so for a third and final time, he now sparks with anger and says, I challenge you again. Rurik goes to get up, sees something in him, and sits back down. And he explains, he says, you need to understand, and he explains what's happening with the Selesnians, and that something needs to be done.
Right.
And in doing so, his cousin steps up, touches his arm, because he says, he now looks and realizes Aris, he being Aris realizes that he is on fire at this point. Not painfully so, but in rage. He is aflame, literally aflame. And his cousin comes up and puts his hand on his shoulder and says, I stand with Aris. And his cousin, the fire goes to his cousin. Dryzek comes up, hand on the shoulder. I also stand with Aris. Flame goes to Dryzek. Boz steps up, same thing. And so finally, because of this, seeing that Aris really cares and is correct, Rurik and Thar step up, put their hand on him, and also become a flame. And so now it's all of them together. Basically, every named person that we've met in this story has now gotten the rage that was pent up from however many years of Aris never activating his own rage before, and now they are going to stop this from happening. They're finally going to take back their lands. That's the story. That's where it ends. Yeah, exactly. So, on to the review of the story. There was a lot to like here, I feel like. I really, really liked the resolution a lot. I think that ending was really sweet.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine how they will, excuse me, how they will close off these stories. But, like, in terms of, like, I want to know what happens next. I don't imagine this is going to be shown to us in the novel, although I will say that I do recall, I believe I recall, and I might be wrong, but I believe they said that there will be online web fiction in conjunction with the story, with the book. And the book, it seems like, is going to be focused on the Planeswalkers and Nicol Bolas and the end of the Gatewatch, whereas these online stories might be the continuation of this, or the conflict among the guilds and things like that, because the guilds aren't necessarily going to care as much. I mean, some of them are literally being controlled by Planeswalkers who are working for Bolas. I get that. Interestingly, the Gruul is one of them, because Domri, all these Planeswalkers that are not of the Gatewatch seem to be working for Bolas in one way, shape, or form. So, Domri included in that. We will see what that means for the Gruul, but Rurik and Thar are, I mean, they're a named entity. We've heard of them in the past. They don't have a card from Guilds or Ravnica Allegiance. They might in the third set, although I don't know what direction they're going with that one, with War of the Spark. But we will find out. But regardless, it was really nice to see a known character such as Rurik and Thar. We hear about Dryzek, who I don't believe we've heard of before, at least I have not. But that was neat. And I also, I guess to go into the review, Dryzek was interesting. We had somebody comment on our video last week, and it was a very interesting observation and something that we missed. And they called us out, which was right to do so. Not like, oh, you guys suck, but like saying, like, hey, I think you guys missed something. The seer, or I forget what they're called, but the woman who could, like, see the future, and who they used, the Azorius used to use them to arrest people for crimes that they would have committed, Minority Report style. She said, made a comment that of all the people that escaped from jail after last week's story, there was one who was more dangerous than all the others. And the commenter believed that it was Domri that she was referring to, because she didn't mention a name. I think, now that we've started this week's story, and one of the first things we hear is that Dryzek has escaped from prison, and they went right to war and destroying everything. Yes. I think it was about Dryzek now. Like, that's just what, I mean, it logically tracks to me that that's what that would mean, going one by one like that. But I could be wrong, but that's kind of what that made me think of, was just the callback to immediately the end, like what was said towards the end of last week's story. Now it's right at the beginning of this week's. To me, that's what makes sense. And so I thought that was kind of neat and interesting. Do you have anything to say? Should I go on to the next thing? I don't know. All right, so there were two lines in here that I loved so much, and they seemed, reading them, I needed to read it again, at least for this first one, where Aris mentions that they're going and destroying all these buildings and all this man-made stuff to bring nature back from the brink of civilization. Yeah. That is
so cool.
Yes, because at first I read it and I like breezed right by it. I was like, all right, next sentence, and then I was like, wait a minute, what did that say? And I went back and I said to Amy, right when we were reading it, I was like, did you see what that just said? Did you hear what that just said? And she was like, what? And I was like, look, from the brink of civilization. How cool is that? And again, Gruul are about nature and destruction, green and red. So you have that concept of they care about nature, and anything that's not nature or that's encroaching on nature, they're going to destroy it. It's very flavorful. It makes a lot of sense to me. So I liked that line a lot. And it goes along with what Aris said later, which is that the mission statement for them going out and destroying all of these things is to cure Ravnica of a disease that manifests as gratuitous construction and institutional corruption.
Yeah.
That is awesome. That is so cool. And again, what more but those two lines do you need to know to understand what the Gruul's intentions here are, or motivations?
Right.
Nothing. The rest of the story is great, and you should read the rest of the story, but you don't need more than those two lines to know at least overarchingly what the Gruul are trying to accomplish in their day-to-day lives. Going out and destroying all these buildings and anything man-made. And this is why. I thought that was great.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that. You then had... you had a line that was funny, right? I would say, and maybe tell me if you agree or not,
Okay.
I think this story was not as funny as last week's.
That's definitely true.
Which it didn't have to be, in my opinion, but it wasn't. I do want to say that the one line that made me laugh a lot, and I don't know that it was supposed to be as funny as I found it, but it was super funny because I'm a child. But I liked when Aris went up to tattoo Dryzek, and Dryzek is there with his like human servants or whatever, and they step up to try to stop Aris, and Dryzek's like, "Oh no, it's fine. Let me get tattooed." And Aris sees that there's freshly cooking drake with, I think they said, a melon in its mouth. So as opposed to a pig on a spit with an apple, they have a drake on a spit with a melon, which I thought was great. Great visual.
Yep.
And then it was Rurik and Thar, I guess, because they then ripped it in half and each started eating one of the wings. That was what it was. So Aris really wanted some of the drake to the point where he said that his mouth got slippery inside. What a hilariously disgusting way to describe that his mouth watered. Because he's a Viashino, right? He's a lizard person. They're not going to say, "Oh, my mouth watered," like humans do. Nope, it got slippery inside. Gross. It's like, why say it that way?
Why is that gross?
Well, it's a weird way of saying it.
Yeah.
And I appreciated it because it made perfect, flavorful sense. But it was that, again, so that was to me like the comedic moment of the whole story, whereas last week, that was sprinkled all over the place.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that. And then there's only one other thing that I wanted to talk about. So unless you had something else.
Okay.
The mentioning that Aris found his spark, if you will, for rage through the Selesnian magic, stealing resources from the Gruul lands. And he even said it doesn't matter as much because we won't starve, right? The animals may go hungry or whatever, but we are going to keep going and destroying and going further out, so we're not going to run out of land to pilfer and destroy. But the problem is the rubble belt here where we are is being destroyed. And the animals are being destroyed, the plants are being malnourished, and that's a problem, and I don't like that. But the other thing that he said, especially when he went up to Rurik and Thar and challenged them 3 times, the other thing that allowed him to spark fully and inflame himself was the fact that he said that he also realized that his people, meaning the Viashino, were not in any of the stories that he read from the Gruul clan or heard about from the Gruul clan. They were never told in stories about ever. Ogres, sure. Giants, sure. Humans, yes. Viashino, no. He was not being properly represented.
Yeah.
His people were not being properly represented, despite the fact that they also were members of the Gruul clans. And he was very upset by that. And that is what caused him to spark and to become a flame. And again, that is a concern that I have heard many times within the Magic the Gathering community, within many different, like the LGBT community, in forms of media here in the real world. And Nikki Drayden has done an amazing job in the past of doing that, of of taking real world problems and introducing them into her stories as parts, right? My opinion, and take it where it's coming from a white male such as myself, but she is never preachy about it. My opinion.
Okay.
Right? It's presented, it's shown to you. If you want to see it there, it's there. If you don't, I feel like you could ignore it.
Okay.
But we've talked about this in the past. Her Guilds of Ravnica stories touched on issues of racism.
Yeah.
It was not blatant about it. It was not the entire story where it was like, this person is racist and I hate them and I'm going to fight them because they're not respecting my culture and my people. No, but it was touched on because that's a real world problem that marginalized groups run into.
Yeah.
Again, racism for particular races and ethnicities, but again, if you're a member of a community such as the LGBT community, you can be discriminated against for that. And that was brought up then. And this is an example of improper representation or lacking representation, I should say. And it's something that he was very passionate about, our main character. And it was at the end, or near the end, where we found this out, and it wasn't harped on, but it was touched on. And I really appreciate Nikki's ability to put those real world aspects in there. Because, and like I said, and yet not beat you over the head with it. Because many people have said, and I somewhat agree with this, but not entirely, that you read or watch a movie or watch television or whatever, consume entertainment to escape. Some people do that. They consume entertainment to escape from the day-to-day. Because for some people, this world is not the best every day. Right? It's rough. It's rough out there for some people. And I understand that to the best degree that I can understand that. But it is problematic for some. And so I don't know. I really appreciated that this was in here. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what you're saying about the fact that Nikki's stories kind of frequently have these pieces of sort of real world, just ways that they relate, I guess. Yeah, I like it because I think not only does it help the reader relate, but it also helps the reader understand the world a bit better. Because obviously there is no world that's so one-dimensional, you know? And I think it would be easy, maybe, for the audience to assume that a world where magic is, you know, prevalent, that maybe things that are uglier about the real world don't necessarily exist in that world. Or it might be easy for an author to just kind of leave those things out so that even if the reader has a vague understanding that those things do exist in that world, they might not understand the level to which they exist in that world, or how they exist in that world, how those things interact with various other things, right? Because in the real world, like I said, it's not so one-dimensional. We're able to, as people in society, view our world in a certain way that kind of allows us to see how that racism exists, but also how racism affects different groups, right? Or how, whatever, it doesn't have to be racism, whatever the thing is, right? So I think, like I said, I think it would be easy for an author to just kind of leave that stuff out, because it'll kind of complicate the story, or it'll make the story more grim, or it'll make the story less of an escape, like you said.
Absolutely.
But I think it's really important for us to get a real feel for the actual plane of Ravnica. I mean,
turns out real people live there. I mean, but that's what, like you were saying, that's what the stories help to show. Sorry.
Yeah. So, we can see that this discrimination does exist. We can see that that there's a lot of turbulence between these different, among all of the different guilds, even though we can't necessarily see how they interact with each other quite yet in the stories. But I think it's really important for the stories to be that detailed and that multifaceted, because even if it's just touched on in this story, that means it can be called back on in a later story, so that we can get more of an understanding of what that actually means for the world as a whole.
Right. And don't forget, I mean, Nikki had the opportunity with these stories to look at the real world, day-to-day life of members of these different guilds. But even if you go back to the Pride of the Crawl, Alison Lures' story from, at this point, a year and a half, 2 years ago, I think something like that. She did a really good job of showing us with our introduction to Mazarek, who is one of the Crawl, one of the insect people, who is now, as we found out through the Golgari story, kind of at the right hand of Varaska, right, as her necromantic specialist or what have you. Mazarek was being heavily discriminated against. You insect people, who cares about you? And turns out the guy who was saying that, or the group of soldiers who came who were saying that, they all got killed because Mazarek was kind of tired of it. And so Varaska, knew that and was friends with Mazarek and cared enough. So that's another example of just the fact that, it makes Ravnica a real world. And I was going to use an example from a different form of media that Wizards has talked about being interested in, and we've talked about this a million times as well. The Marvel model, right? Marvel is kind of big right now. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but with their movies, but also, they're based on comic books. So their comic books, their movies, their characters in general are popular because why? Well, their characters started to become popular because they had flaws, right? Yeah. Sure, Thor is a god. Well, originally in the comics, I'll put my geek hat on for a bit, Thor originally in the comics was a human being named Dr. Donald Blake who had a walking stick. He had a disability. And yet when he would strike that walking stick on the ground, it would turn into Mjolnir, the hammer, and he would turn into Thor. So even the god of thunder that was Thor was portrayed as a human being with a disability. Spider-Man had to balance life and school and relationships. He was just a young guy trying to figure it all out while also being a superhero, which he was because he lost someone close to him based on a mistake that he made. All of these things make these characters relatable characters, right? Even the Hulk, he can't control that aspect of himself, Bruce Banner. So it's a way of making your characters, your larger-than-life characters, right, living in a world where magic exists to help them do things. You give them flaws. you give them real world concerns and problems, and then you show them attempting to overcome those problems. I love it. I mean, that's why these stories are so good and so compelling, and why we've been asking for stories like this for a very long time, and now we're finally getting them, because, again, and I'll reference it, I've referenced it a million times, when we were on Amonkhet, we got really good introductions into these random people that we saw one time, and then never again, either because Ronus showed up and then was killed by the end of the story, or because, it was that character was only needed for that one story, and then we didn't really see them again. But you better believe if we return to Amonkhet, I'm going to be real excited because I want to know how those characters are doing.
Yeah, me too.
Because I really got invested in them, even though it was only for one story, which is what I want. If we see Aris again, fighting alongside Rurik and Thar and Dryzek and Baz, and I want to see that, because I'm interested in these characters now.
Yeah.
So I think that's the way to do that, to make these stories interesting, is you give them a real world hook. And again, I'm not going to pretend that I can 100% relate to feeling like I lack representation in media, but I am very aware of the fact that I have seen many people discussing it and feeling that they are underrepresented in different forms of media, whether it's because of their race or their religion or their ethnicity or their sexual orientation or any of the other myriad of things that could come up where they feel like they're underrepresented. And I've seen that those people can be very passionate about that. And we got to see someone who portrayed that in this story. You have a small Viashino who had never raged before in his life, stepping up to a double-headed ogre who had been raging for who knows how many years, and stepping up to try to fight, because it was something that they cared about that strongly.
Right, because it's not even to try to fight. It's just, if I keep doing this to them enough times, maybe they'll listen to me.
Exactly. It's the only way I can get them to listen.
Yeah.
Right. And again, I will mention it for those of you that may not know, but I think Nikki Drayden is perfectly positioned for that, because Nikki Drayden being female and being a person of color. And so those two aspects, allowing her to possibly draw from her own experiences in feeling this way, and or from communities that she might be a part of, or things that she might have heard, or stories that she might have heard from others, being able to pull from that in personifying these characters in this world.
I mean, how many times has she had to feel like she's had to fight for just the ability for somebody to listen to her?
Right.
You know?
And it, from me,
and especially her being a storyteller, I feel like that proves that even more, because I feel like if you're a storyteller, that means that you actually really have something to say.
Yes.
Yeah. And so if you've had a fight in your life to get people to listen to you, when you have that much to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. So, I mean, overall, this was quite good.
Great story.
Yeah. Very, very good.
Great.
Very good. So, that's probably going to be it for this week, unless you have anything else.
Gruul rocks? I mean...
Not Gruul, then die. We actually, I feel bad the camera's not angled low enough, but Amy's shirt says Born Wild on it. I love it. I think it's really cool.
Can you see it?
Yeah, now you can. Can you see it? So, apologies for the late output of this video. First of all, we said that it was going to go out on Saturday, which was later than Thursday, because we wanted Amy to be at 100% for her clan's story, if you will, her guild story. And we said it was going to be out on Saturday, but Spoilers, I'm looking down at my clock over there. It's now Sunday at the time that we are finishing filming this. So, sorry. If you couldn't tell, this wasn't the Azorius story despite how I'm dressed, but I had an event to go to tonight, so I apologize. But we are getting it out to you as soon as we can, and we will still have a video out on Monday. So, because that's just what we do. We have 2 videos a week because we want to. So, thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed, and in fact, I think, we already did the Azorius kit, so we just had the Gruul story. Stay tuned for the Gruul kit, and whoo boy, you're not going to want to miss that one on Monday. So if you haven't seen it yet, definitely, if it's Monday at noon or later Eastern, I definitely recommend you go watch that video as well. So thank you guys so much for watching this episode of JaAR here on Geek for All. I have been Joe.
And I'm Amy.
Don't think I forgot. Thank you for joining us as we got to show off a little bit later than usual our...
#Worthos Pride.
And please feel free to show off yours by giving us your opinions of our opinions, as well as the story in general, in the comments down below. We love to hear from you.
We really want to know what you have to say.
Yes, please and thank you. And especially, like we talked about with last week, if you think we missed something. Because who does it happen? So thank you once again. Check out some of the other videos on the channel. They'll be popping up. You can subscribe up here. And as we always say, guys, in whichever video of ours you watch next, we will see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.